Most people assume they know what someone is worth by the title on their badge or the uniform they wear. But what if the man pushing a mop down a long hallway was the only person in the building capable of preventing a catastrophe? That's exactly what happened one stormy morning when a routine security shift turned into something that would shake the entire base. A night janitor, nearly invisible to everyone around him, walked into a restricted zone and fixed a malfunctioning missile guidance system without hesitation, while seasoned engineers stood clueless. Within hours, the base general ordered a full investigation, only to discover a past so extraordinary it had been erased from official records. This is the story of how a forgotten man saved lives, revealed his true identity, and left a legacy no one saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. On the outskirts of Fort Ridgeton, a classified military testing base buried deep in the Wyoming wilderness, rain lashed against tall security fences as floodlights flickered in the early morning gloom. Inside the compound, the graveyard shift was winding down. Most personnel were either asleep or bleary-eyed from their night duties. The silence was broken only by the occasional buzz of intercoms and the rhythmic squeak of a janitor's mop as it traced paths across polished linoleum floors. The man holding it was Miles Jensen, a stoop-shouldered custodian in his late 50s with a graying beard and wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slid down his nose. To the casual observer, he was nothing more than part of the background noise, a fixture of the night, polite, quiet, efficient, and utterly forgettable. Miles had been working night shifts at Fort Ridgeton for the past 7 months. He clocked in precisely at 10 p.m. and out at 6 a.m., kept his head down, rarely spoke unless spoken to, and navigated the halls with a mechanical sort of grace. Despite being invisible to most, the overnight security guard, Private Daniel Reeves, had taken a quiet interest in the janitor. Reeves was young, fresh out of training, and assigned to surveillance rotation during the quiet hours of the night. Watching dozens of monitors fed from security cameras placed across the compound gave him plenty of time to observe routine patterns. Miles's routine, however, was so precise it felt choreographed. But one night, that pattern broke. It was around 3:14 a.m. when Reeves noticed something odd. A motion alert flickered red across the console, indicating unauthorized presence in hallway C-17, a corridor leading to the testing wing of the Missile Systems Division, a heavily restricted area. The camera feed came up and showed Miles walking slowly toward a room marked Guidance Systems Lab. Reeves stared, confused. That area was locked down for maintenance, following a system error earlier that day. It was sealed off until engineers could return at 08:00. Miles, however, seemed neither confused nor hesitant. He moved with purpose, swiped a badge Reeves had never seen him use before, and entered the room. Reeves radioed his supervisor, but there was static. The storm outside had disrupted some communications, and backup protocols were in effect. With uncertainty clawing at him, Reeves decided to observe through the cameras instead of intervening immediately. What he saw next would stay with him forever. Inside the lab, Miles approached the central console. The room was dimly lit, surrounded by steel racks of server arrays, blinking lights, and cables like veins running from the walls to the testing rig. Miles knelt beside the guidance system, pulled a maintenance panel open, and started working, not fumbling or poking randomly like someone who didn't belong, but with smooth, confident precision. He typed commands into a terminal. He adjusted circuit junctions. At one point, he paused, read a diagnostic readout, and recalibrated a targeting alignment sequence. 15 minutes later, the system's status indicators went from red to green, operational. Reeves sat frozen. His training told him this wasn't just a breach. It was impossible. Janitors didn't have clearance for missile labs. Janitors didn't know how to debug software embedded in warhead delivery systems. Janitors didn't move like former engineers, or maybe even former operatives. And yet, the man on the screen was Miles Jensen, the same quiet soul who mopped floors and smiled politely at passing officers. By the time the system registered all functions nominal, Miles had already wiped down the workstation, closed the panel, and exited the lab with the same calm stride he had entered with. He didn't seem rushed. He didn't seem nervous. He didn't even glance at the camera. Reeves waited until the end of his shift, pacing silently, mind spinning. When the morning personnel arrived, he filed a formal report. He expected backlash, maybe even disciplinary action. Instead, the moment his report reached Colonel Whitaker, the commanding officer overseeing base operations, all activity on the upper floors came to a halt. A team of military police was dispatched to intercept Miles Jensen before he left the premises, but when they found him in the locker room, lacing up his boots, he simply stood, looked up, and waited. He didn't argue. He didn't flee. He only said it was going to fail. Someone needed to fix it. By noon, the general himself was at Fort Ridgeton, poring over Jensen's personnel file, which was unusually sparse. No former employment history. No educational background. Only a social security number and a scanned driver's license. Within hours, that file was flagged, encrypted, and rerouted to a higher clearance department. And that's when the truth started to unravel. Not only about what had just happened, but about who this man had once been and why someone so skilled had vanished into obscurity. What began as an odd surveillance blip was about to become the story of a hidden genius, a forgotten tragedy, and a second chance that would restore more than just a missile system. It would restore hope. Miles Jensen's mornings were as quiet and methodical as his nights. After every graveyard shift, he would walk half a mile from Fort Ridgeton's rear staff exit to the tiny cabin he rented at the edge of the woods. The cabin had no television, no internet, and no vehicle parked outside. A single coat hung by the door, worn and patched. Inside, a twin mattress lay on the floor, beside a rusted metal desk and a hot plate. Stacks of books were arranged with almost obsessive precision: technical manuals, systems theory, engineering textbooks, and outdated editions of defense protocols from the Cold War era. Most of them had dog-eared pages, notes, scribbled in margins with clean, analytical handwriting. Despite the Spartan surroundings, the room was immaculate. Everything in its place, everything with a function, just like Miles. To the few people who ever spoke to him, Miles seemed like a man content with routine. He nodded when greeted. He answered questions directly, but rarely elaborated. He never spoke of family, past work, or even hobbies. He declined invitations to staff luncheons, potlucks, or holiday shifts, with the same polite, unwavering refusal. The younger night crew made up stories about him. Some joked that he was a failed professor, others said he was ex-military with PTSD who wanted a quiet life. No one really knew. And Miles didn't offer clues. His uniform was always clean, but not new. His posture, while unassuming, carried a residual discipline, like someone who had once needed to be ready for anything at a moment's notice. There was a kind of tension beneath the stillness, like a coiled spring waiting for a reason to move. What most didn't see, and what security had never caught until that night, was that Miles had memorized the layout of the entire base, down to the sublevels. Every corridor, panel, ventilation shaft, and hidden security override. He avoided surveillance blind spots, not out of mischief, but as though it were second nature. His nightly cleaning pattern wasn't just a janitorial route. It was a loop through critical infrastructure: backup generator rooms, maintenance closets, server storage, power relays, and emergency control junctions. If anyone had paid close enough attention, they would have realized he checked those areas not just for dust, but for anomalies. Loose wires, unusual temperature shifts, malfunctioning panels, and he fixed them, not with duct tape or guesswork, but with precision that rivaled the trained engineers on base. But Miles never bragged, never reported the issues, and never left a trace. He moved through the halls like a shadow, present, observing, always one step ahead. His choice of night shifts, his aversion to company, and his absolute commitment to anonymity weren't just quirks. They were shields, carefully placed to keep his identity buried. Because beneath the janitor's name tag, behind the mop and bucket, lay a man who had once stood in briefing rooms with four-star generals. A man who had written code for missile guidance systems, corrected flaws in defense protocols, and testified before closed congressional committees. That man had died, at least on paper, nearly 20 years ago. Miles wasn't his real name. The man once known as Dr. Silas Monroe had vanished after a tragedy so catastrophic that his credentials, history, and legacy were deliberately sealed away. There had been a launch failure, a software override misfire, and 23 lives lost aboard an experimental defense satellite that spiraled into the Atlantic during re-entry. Though an investigation cleared him of wrongdoing, Silas had blamed himself. A single missed subroutine buried deep in the override protocol had made the system vulnerable. He resigned quietly, disappeared from the defense sector, and changed his name using a synthetic identity buried under federal protection layers. It was never a witness protection program. No one had threatened him. He simply vanished because he could not bear to live in the shadow of what had happened. He wandered for years, working in libraries, warehouses, shipyards. Anywhere his technical past wouldn't matter. He never stayed long. But eventually, he found himself in Wyoming, near Fort Ridgeton, where he recognized the design architecture of the testing grounds. The base was built using blueprints and digital infrastructure from systems he had helped develop decades earlier. It was familiar, like returning to a home you weren't allowed to claim, and so he stayed. Not to reclaim his past, but to quietly safeguard what he had once helped create. It was not guilt that drove him. It was duty, a duty he couldn't explain to anyone because no one would believe him. So when the missile guidance system failed that night and maintenance protocols lagged due to weather, Miles hadn't hesitated. He had reviewed the alerts days before on unprotected relay logs during his cleaning rounds. He had seen the cascading error coming, and when it arrived, he had the tools and the knowledge to correct it. Not because he wanted recognition, not because he was desperate to reclaim a title, but because he knew what failure looked like. And he would not allow it to happen again, not on his watch, not ever. The man who returned to his cabin after every shift didn't see himself as a hero. He wasn't hiding because he was afraid of being caught. He was hiding because he didn't believe he deserved to be found. But that night changed everything. Not because he had acted, but because someone had seen him. For the first time in decades, he had been witnessed doing what he had once been known for. And that visibility, that accidental exposure, was about to bring his buried past roaring back into the light. And somewhere, beneath the surface of his quiet life, something inside him stirred. Not regret, not pride, but the unfamiliar feeling that maybe, just maybe, he was not done yet. Fort Ridgeton stood like a relic from another era, hidden in the desolate folds of Wyoming's coldest plains, surrounded by layers of fencing, motion sensors, satellite uplinks, and weathered concrete buildings built to endure both time and silence. The compound, established in the 1970s, during the height of Cold War paranoia, had evolved into a highly classified testing and diagnostics facility for missile defense systems. While some military installations projected intimidation or grandeur, Fort Ridgeton did the opposite. From the outside, it resembled a rundown logistics depot, modest in structure and intentionally forgettable. Its true significance was buried beneath the ground. Sublevels filled with miles of cable corridors, blast-proof labs, thermal shielding, and servers humming like dormant giants in deep sleep. The place was designed for secrecy, function over form, and redundancy over elegance. There was no decorative flair, no ceremonial flags waving proudly in the wind, only stern silence and storm-thick skies. The weather was an ever-present force, like a breathing entity with its own agenda. Long winters dragged out through spring, rain hammered steel rooftops at irregular intervals, and wind tunneled through empty corridors like whispers of forgotten things. It made everything feel on edge, as if the entire base lived in anticipation of something no one could name. Security patrols moved in cycles, technicians rotated in strict schedules, and the hierarchy of command operated like a closed loop with little patience for small talk or disruptions. Silence was currency. Obedience was expected. And everyone, no matter their role, knew that the heart of Fort Ridgeton beat not in its offices or mess halls, but in Sub-Level 3, where the experimental guidance and targeting systems for next-generation missile defense programs were housed. That's where careers were made, reputations destroyed, and decisions were logged under classified codes never spoken aloud. Inside those subterranean levels, the environment shifted from cold steel to something almost biological. The deeper one went, the more claustrophobic it became. Narrow hallways were lit by thin fluorescent tubes that buzzed constantly. Concrete walls sweated in humid corners near server racks, where heat from machines met the chill of air recycling units. Cables hung from ceilings in tightly bound rows, like the sinews of some enormous beast. All surfaces were scrubbed to sterile perfection, not for aesthetics, but to preserve the sensitive calibration of the systems housed within. Even dust could corrupt the delicate balance of the experimental hardware being tested. The main control room for the missile guidance system, known unofficially among staff as the Core, was a reinforced octagonal space with no windows and one thick, pressure-sealed door. Inside, rows of consoles faced a central holographic interface where targeting simulations were run day and night. The air always smelled faintly of coolant and ozone. The monitors displayed real-time data from mock warhead trajectories, vector simulations, and global satellite pinging feedback. Engineers assigned to this room wore badges indicating their security clearance color, a visual hierarchy that determined who could speak, who could observe, and who was simply there to support. In this world, there was no room for emotional decisions or improvisation. Every keystroke was logged, every access swipe timed, and every piece of hardware tagged to a long chain of accountability. This was the environment where Miles Jensen operated, but not as a participant, as a custodian. He moved through these spaces after hours, when the lights dimmed, when voices ceased, and when the terminals glowed like soft lanterns in an underwater abyss. During his shifts, he'd walk past classified doors left slightly ajar, peer at system updates flashing across screens, and occasionally pause when he saw familiar error codes he hadn't seen since before he'd buried his identity. The architecture of the place hadn't changed much since he'd helped draft the theoretical backbone of its digital design decades ago under his real name. He recognized the logic trees, the sequencing delays, the redundancy layers tucked like sleeping fail-safes into systems that newer engineers thought were self-evident. What they didn't realize was that much of their current infrastructure wasn't the result of a recent breakthrough. It was a refined version of concepts conceived by ghosts of the past. Above ground, Fort Ridgeton was a series of low-rise buildings spread across nearly 400 acres. There were barracks for the personnel, a central operations office, and smaller satellite buildings for storage, logistics, and vehicle maintenance. The airstrip, rarely used, sat mostly abandoned except during monthly equipment deliveries. Its cracked surface and overgrown edges were symbolic of the base itself, functional, resilient, but forgotten by time. The mess hall served 3 shifts and offered food that was intentionally bland to prevent distractions. Social interactions were minimal, mostly polite nods or brief chatter about shift rotations and protocol updates. It was a world governed by routines, layers of clearance, and an unspoken understanding that asking too many questions was a good way to be transferred, if not removed. For someone like Miles, the atmosphere was perfect. There was no expectation to connect, no pressure to participate, and no scrutiny if you kept your head down. But that same perfection for someone hiding in plain sight also meant danger when the environment shifted, as it had the night he stepped into the lab to fix the system. His invisibility had only worked because the world around him wasn't looking. Now, it was. With one action, he had disrupted the environment's most sacred balance, order without anomaly. And Fort Ridgeton did not take kindly to anomalies. The storm outside raged for days, symbolic of the unease growing within the walls. After the system came back online, higher-ups asked few questions at first, too stunned by the restored function to question how it happened. But when they did look, the environment turned colder. Background checks were reopened, surveillance logs reviewed, and in a place where everyone was cataloged and accounted for, the man who had made the impossible look effortless stood out precisely because he wasn't supposed to stand out at all. The base's environment, once a protective shell of secrecy and protocol, was now a hunting ground for answers, for accountability, and most of all, for the truth about the janitor, who wasn't a janitor at all. Colonel Travis Whitaker had never liked surprises. A career man with nearly 3 decades in military intelligence and advanced systems logistics, he built his reputation on predictability and absolute control. His quarters, located in the north wing of Fort Ridgeton's command tower, reflected his personality with chilling precision. Every file labeled, every object on his desk aligned at perfect right angles, and every decision filtered through a series of risk matrices before action was taken. Whitaker didn't raise his voice, he didn't bark commands, and he didn't need to. His authority was the kind that moved in shadows, quiet, firm, and absolute. Beneath the veneer of professionalism and calm lay a man who had learned long ago that unpredictability was the real enemy, and anyone who disrupted the flow of order, no matter how well-intentioned, was a threat that had to be neutralized quickly and cleanly. When Private Reeves filed the initial incident report about the janitor's unauthorized access to the guidance lab, it landed on Whitaker's desk within an hour. He read it once, twice, then a third time, not because he didn't believe it, but because he did. Reeves was not a soldier prone to embellishment. The young guard had scored high in observational aptitude and decision-making under stress. If he said the janitor accessed a restricted lab and restored a broken missile system using knowledge that only a handful of engineers on base possessed, then Whitaker didn't doubt it. But belief and tolerance were two different things. To Whitaker, it didn't matter whether the system had been fixed. What mattered was that protocol had been broken. And not just broken, shattered. Access had been granted without clearance. Surveillance logs showed movements that defied the base's internal clearance hierarchy, and now questions were being whispered among the technical teams, sowing uncertainty. That was unacceptable. By 0900, Whitaker had summoned the head of base security, a man named Captain Rowe, and tasked him with one goal: find out everything about Miles Jensen. Not just his employee file, but his origin, his references, the agency that contracted him, and most importantly, how he came to possess a clearance badge that should not exist in any registry. By 1100, Rowe returned with more questions than answers. The badge had no digital log of being issued. Jensen's employment file listed him as a civilian contractor through a third-party janitorial agency based in Colorado. But when they reached out, the company claimed they had no record of assigning a cleaner named Miles Jensen to Fort Ridgeton. His social security number was valid but tied to a profile with almost no digital footprint. No tax filings for the previous decade. No property ownership. No vehicle registration. No known relatives. It was as if he had materialized out of thin air 7 months ago, then slipped seamlessly into the base's operations. Whitaker's mind moved swiftly, not toward curiosity, but toward containment. He had dealt with classified leaks and infiltration attempts before, black ops agents with deep cover, foreign operatives embedded in domestic roles, even rogue ex-contractors who went dark only to resurface in sensitive installations. But this was different. The man had corrected a guidance error that the assigned engineers had yet to even diagnose. That level of skill suggested not just familiarity with the system, but authorship. Yet the system in question had only been implemented 5 years prior using code updated from obsolete Cold War schematics. Whoever Jensen really was, he wasn't just a rogue technician. He was someone who knew more than he should, and in a facility designed around absolute knowledge hierarchies, That made him dangerous. By noon, Whitaker had contacted Command Integration in Washington under encrypted channels. He relayed the breach in vague terms, requesting a background trace on the man known as Miles Jensen. The answer he received 2 hours later confirmed his worst suspicion. The name Silas Monroe appeared on the classified backend of their digital personnel matrix, a name that had been redacted from all operational files, sealed by Executive Directive Level 7, and flagged under Inactive No Contact. Silas Monroe was, as far as the federal system was concerned, legally dead. The attached notation was brief but chilling. Former lead engineer of the Argus Satellite Defense Initiative, withdrawn from service following catastrophic system failure, presumed compromised, voluntarily disappeared. Whitaker sat in silence for nearly 15 minutes after reading the report. He knew the Argus disaster by reputation. Everyone in Military Systems Command did. It was one of the most expensive and tragic failures in the history of U.S. defense programs, the kind that haunted career officers and ended legislative tenures. And now, its ghost was mopping the floors of Fort Ridgeton. It wasn't guilt or remorse that drove Whitaker's next decision. It was calculation. If this man, this hidden expert, had somehow returned from the shadows and taken it upon himself to engage with a highly volatile system without authorization, then he had to be brought under control. Immediately. The base could not afford rumors, much less disruption. Already, word had spread among the engineers that someone had fixed the core ahead of schedule. Theories abounded, and when people asked questions in environments like Fort Ridgeton, operational integrity suffered. Whitaker knew he had to act swiftly and decisively to prevent that. He ordered Monroe's detainment, not with cuffs and accusations, but under the guise of a, quote, debriefing. He summoned a full blackout on Jensen's movements, revoked access to all janitorial zones, and initiated a temporary lockdown on Sublevel 3 under, quote, technical review. He did not yet know Monroe's motives, whether the man was seeking redemption, revenge, or merely drifting through the remnants of his past, like a ghost haunting familiar corridors. What he did know was that someone capable of operating outside the structure Whitaker had worked so hard to maintain posed a threat to the very foundation of the base's command flow. To Whitaker, Miles Jensen was no longer a mystery. He was a variable, and variables, especially brilliant ones with broken pasts and untethered loyalties, were dangerous. The colonel had seen enough in his career to know that brilliance unchecked was a greater threat than ignorance weaponized. It didn't matter that Monroe had fixed the system. It didn't matter that he might have saved lives. What mattered was that he had done so outside the framework of sanctioned authority. In Whitaker's world, that was the greatest sin of all. And now, with the weight of classified history behind him, Colonel Whitaker prepared to remind everyone, especially the man who called himself Miles Jensen, that Fort Ridgeton had no room for ghosts. For 7 months, Fort Ridgeton had moved to a silent rhythm, and Miles Jensen had become an unnoticed instrument of that rhythm, gliding through the early morning corridors like a whisper that cleaned up after the day's chaos. His routine was as precise as the circuitry he used to work on in a past life. Floor by floor, wing by wing, mop strokes at perfect intervals, tools returned to their exact place in the cart, lights turned off in a consistent order. No camera had ever caught him lingering too long in one place, and no superior had ever received a complaint about the janitor, who worked when most others were dreaming or drowning in caffeine-fueled reports. The security staff grew used to seeing the faded Navy uniform with the stitched patch reading M. Jensen, and even those who noticed his quiet discipline came to accept it as just another quirk in the machinery of the base. Every night his path would cross briefly with Private Reeves, who occupied the overnight security console in Wing Delta. Reeves had come to view Miles as part of the building itself, unthreatening, always on time, never off course. But what Reeves had not realized until the night of the incident was that the janitor's route had not been designed for efficiency, it had been designed for oversight. Over time, Miles had carefully mapped out a rotation that took him through every area connected to the base's critical systems. Though he carried a mop, his eyes tracked systems indicators, electrical panels, and the blinking rhythms of diagnostic screens left running after engineers abandoned their shifts. He memorized everything. He wasn't watching the floors. He was watching the pulse of the compound. This routine, this pattern, had been born not out of curiosity but out of necessity. The moment Miles had seen Fort Ridgeton's internal network during his first week, had glimpsed its foundations, and realized how much of its architecture was built on iterations of systems he once co-designed, he knew he could not remain passive. And so the pattern began. Each night he ensured that the water supply to the cooling vents remained uninterrupted. He cleaned beneath the access panel of the emergency relay room, not because it gathered dust, but because someone had rerouted a cable improperly and it was beginning to draw heat. He kept the mop bucket filled, but would often leave it in a hallway for 5 minutes as he disappeared into a side room, adjusting server humidity levels or reseating backup processors that had vibrated loose from subfloor tremors during storm surges. He never logged these repairs, he never claimed responsibility, he never told anyone what he had done or how he knew. But gradually, incidents that should have triggered maintenance alerts simply never happened. An overloaded capacitor never exploded. A guidance relay never failed a pressure check. In the darkness of the night, he was an invisible mechanic, tuning a machine too vast for anyone to see in full. And no one noticed. No one except Reeves, who had only begun to suspect something when the janitor's path one night subtly deviated and led straight into a zone he should never have entered. The irony was that even Colonel Whitaker had indirectly benefited from Miles's secret interventions. Reports crossed his desk every quarter noting abnormally high operational stability for a base tasked with experimental testing. The colonel, meticulous in his standards, took pride in the figures and assumed his engineers were simply exceeding expectations. The truth was more complex. Fort Ridgeton's systems were surviving under quiet supervision from a man whose job title listed him as a sanitation technician. The engineers had begun to grow confident, perhaps too confident, in the self-regulating capacity of their experimental modules, not realizing that unseen hands were preventing their oversights from becoming disasters. But even ritual cannot go unnoticed forever. The night Miles fixed the guidance system, he had broken his pattern. That breach had exposed not just his actions, but the long string of decisions that had kept the compound humming. Whitaker's orders to lock down all access points and interrogate the janitor were the beginning of a new pattern, one forged in fear and a need to regain control. The colonel now walked through the facility with sharper glances. Staff briefings began to include veiled warnings about unauthorized interventions and strict adherence to the command hierarchy. His tone shifted from instructional to watchful, his presence in the labs more frequent. Surveillance reviews were reactivated, with a scope retroactively covering the last 6 months, feeding thousands of hours of footage into AI-assisted pattern recognition systems. And slowly, an uncomfortable truth emerged. The janitor had been everywhere. His access paths, while subtle, had overlapped with high-security equipment zones far too often to be coincidence. The engineers began to whisper. The name Jensen passed from one cautious voice to another, always wrapped in uncertainty. Some wondered if he was military. Others believed he might have been planted by the Department of Defense to audit the base in secret. A few even considered whether he was a liability. The idea that someone so unassuming had quietly understood and corrected systems they struggled with was deeply unsettling. Fort Ridgeton, for all its control, was beginning to feel exposed. And Miles, though aware that eyes were turning toward him, changed nothing. He still cleaned the hallways, still followed the motions of his routine, still nodded politely at the few staff who acknowledged him. But the building had changed. The air felt heavier. Cameras followed him more deliberately. His badge scans, which once allowed smooth entry to secondary access points, now produced brief pauses, delays that weren't technical, but human. He had disrupted the ritual by being too competent. In a place built on hierarchy, he had violated the chain of perceived worth. And the base, like any complex system suddenly confronted with an unexpected variable, had begun to correct itself, not by fixing the problem, but by isolating it. Miles Jensen, or rather Silas Monroe, knew the pattern was breaking. He could feel it in the pauses between footsteps, the narrowing of glances, the silences that grew longer during shift changes. The base was reacting to him the way a body reacts to a foreign object, not immediately with violence, but with slow, calculated rejection. The ritual that had protected him was no longer a cloak. It was now a trail, and others were beginning to follow it. The silence in the base cafeteria that afternoon seemed heavier than usual, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Trey sat alone, elbows on the table, a cup of black coffee growing cold in his hands, his eyes fixed on the surface as if trying to see through time. Around him, soldiers and technicians came and went, unaware that the man in the janitor uniform had just rerouted the fate of one of the country's most classified defense systems. Word hadn't gotten out yet, and Trey had no intention of volunteering it. But it was clear that a current was beginning to ripple through the facility. Whispers, glances, and unspoken questions stirring in the background like a brewing storm. He'd been through this before, that moment when silence precedes the avalanche. But this time, he didn't have a team to lean on, no superior officer to report to, and no orders to follow. He was just a man who couldn't look away when something was broken. And for better or worse, someone had seen him do the impossible. In another wing of the base, Sergeant Lena Quinn paced back and forth in front of a bank of monitors, her brow furrowed as she reviewed footage from the lower wing where the missile diagnostic room was located. She had been working closely with General Roth these past few months on security upgrades, and that meant reviewing a lot of surveillance tapes. What she saw in the footage today, though, made her stop mid-step. There, in grainy black and white, was the janitor, Trey, approaching the locked diagnostic panel, bypassing the secondary protocol shield, and within minutes, correcting a system fault that their own tech team had deemed unsolvable without external contractors. Quinn leaned closer, her eyes narrowing as she watched him move, not with hesitation or curiosity, but with precision and control. She recognized that kind of motion. It wasn't random, it wasn't luck, it was muscle memory. It was the same way combat engineers she'd served with handled live explosives, deliberate, practiced, instinctive. She didn't press the alarm. Instead, she downloaded the footage onto a drive, locked it with her personal encryption key, and marched straight toward General Roth's temporary command office, with a certainty growing in her gut. Meanwhile, Roth was already navigating a storm of reports about the earlier incident in the missile diagnostics room. The lead technician, David Lynn, had filed a quiet but urgent memo that someone had corrected the system error from within the room during a moment of confusion in the lockdown procedure. The technician didn't see who it was, but by the time Roth read the report, there was no way to ignore the weight of it. He had known Trey was different the first time he saw him, not in any dramatic, overt way, but in the way he carried himself, the calm in his eyes, and the quiet discipline in his every movement. Janitors didn't usually walk the base like they belonged there. Trey didn't walk at all. He moved with purpose. Roth had seen men like him before, in the classified briefings and memorial halls of people who officially didn't exist. He had felt the tremor in his gut when he shook Trey's hand that first time, like he was brushing against a ghost. But now he had proof that there was far more to the man than anyone had guessed. Sergeant Quinn entered without knocking, a flash drive in hand and an expression that told Roth she knew something she wasn't sure she wanted to believe. They reviewed the footage together, silence stretching between them like a taut wire. Roth didn't say anything for a long time after the clip ended. Then, he stood slowly, his eyes dark. "Find him," he said, quietly. "Bring him to me." Back in the maintenance corridor, Trey had finished his coffee and returned to his rounds. It had taken years to teach himself to move slow again, to stop scanning every room like it was hostile, to let people walk behind him without instinctively reaching for a weapon he no longer carried. The military had trained him to be a ghost that hunted nightmares in places no one wanted to admit existed. Now he mopped hallways and tightened screws in forgotten corners of a compound he once could have infiltrated blindfolded. It was easier this way. There was peace in being invisible. There was freedom in letting people underestimate you. But peace is fragile, and ghosts can only hide for so long. As he moved toward a small utility closet to swap tools, he heard footsteps, firm, regulated, deliberate, not casual, not friendly, trained. Trey paused, wiped his hands with a rag, and turned just as Sergeant Quinn came into view. She stopped 3 feet from him, met his gaze, and said, "General Roth would like a word. Privately." Trey nodded once, no flicker of surprise in his expression. As he followed her down the corridor, past checkpoints and steel doors that hadn't opened for him in months, he knew the mask had slipped. He had walked into the light. And whatever came next, there was no turning back. The walk to General Roth's office felt longer than it actually was, though neither Trey nor Sergeant Quinn spoke a word. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed steadily, casting long shadows that flickered across the polished concrete floor as they passed. Every step echoed louder than it should have, but Trey's mind was already elsewhere, calculating the possibilities. He had known this moment would eventually come, some version of it at least. Too many variables, too many moving parts, and despite all his efforts to disappear, the machine had noticed him again. He could feel it now, that old instinct waking up inside him like a predator stirred from hibernation. His back straightened a little more, his steps became more deliberate. He wasn't just Trey anymore. Not entirely. By the time Sergeant Quinn held the door open and gestured him inside, his expression was unreadable. General Roth sat behind a wide steel desk littered with secure documents, a half-drunk mug of coffee, and a closed laptop with biometric locks. His uniform was crisp, his posture taut, and his eyes fixed on Trey with the kind of unflinching focus that came from years of giving orders men would die to follow. He didn't say anything at first. He simply studied the man standing before him, taking in the janitor's uniform, the relaxed hands, the expressionless face. Then he gave a small nod toward Quinn, who exited quietly and shut the door behind her. Roth leaned back, laced his fingers together, and exhaled slowly. "I've seen a lot of people do impressive things under pressure," he began, voice calm but with an edge that cut through the stillness. "But very few can override a locked diagnostic panel while the base is on alert, correct a missile error, and then walk away like it didn't happen." Trey said nothing. He didn't flinch. Roth continued, his tone quieter now. "You weren't just a tech, and you're definitely not a janitor." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was electric. Trey finally spoke, voice low and even. "Do you want a confession or a solution?" Roth blinked, caught slightly off guard. Then, slowly, he smiled, not out of amusement, but understanding. He pulled a secure folder from a locked drawer and slid it across the desk. "You're not in trouble," he said, "but I need to know who you are, really." Trey hesitated, then stepped forward and opened the folder. Inside was a profile, his, or close enough. A name he hadn't heard in years. A blurry photo from a mission in a desert that didn't exist. The file was redacted to hell, but the fact Roth had it at all meant doors had been opened. Dangerous ones. "You've been digging," Trey muttered. Roth didn't deny it. "When someone on my base does something that could have saved a dozen lives without being asked, I want to know who I'm dealing with." Trey closed the folder gently. "That version of me is gone. Left him behind for a reason." Roth leaned forward. "Maybe. But right now, I don't need that version full-time. I need someone who understands what it means when systems fail quietly. Someone who knows how to fix things without fanfare or politics." He paused. What happened in that diagnostics room wasn't just luck. That system wasn't supposed to be accessible, which means someone tampered with it. Internally, Trey felt a chill crawl up his spine. Not fear, but recognition. He had suspected as much. The fault wasn't random. It had patterns, the kind that didn't occur naturally. He looked Roth in the eye and said, "You think someone inside is testing response times?" Roth nodded grimly. Or worse, sabotage with plausible deniability. That changed everything. Trey stepped back slightly, folding his arms, not in defiance but in thought. He didn't want to be pulled back in. But if there was something festering inside the base, someone manipulating systems that could launch missiles or shut down defense protocols, he couldn't ignore it. He never could. "If I help," he said slowly, "it stays off record. No ranks, no unit assignments. I work alone." Roth raised an eyebrow. "You'll have limited access, and I'll give you a handler." "Quinn?" Trey didn't argue. He'd already pegged her as sharp and steady. "Then we start tonight, but I want access to all technical logs for the last 72 hours. I want to see who ran diagnostics before the error flagged." Roth nodded, already moving to his terminal. "You'll have it. And Trey." The janitor turned halfway toward the door. "If you find out who's behind this, I need to know before anyone else. There are people above me who'd bury it before we could act." Trey didn't answer. He simply left the room, his mind already assembling the first pieces of the puzzle, the ghost within him fully awake again. Trey didn't return to the janitor's closet that night. He made a quiet detour through maintenance tunnels, avoiding cameras he knew were there, and others most personnel didn't. His badge now carried silent clearance to systems only 3 people on base had access to, and even that had to be buried behind a subroutine that spoofed standard admin protocols. Roth had pulled the strings, yes, but Trey had already begun tugging on them himself the moment the missile system blipped. He hadn't wanted to get involved, not at first. But there was something off about how the system failed. The errors weren't wild or chaotic. They were precise, intentional, too symmetrical to be accidental. That was the first sign. The second was how easily his override worked. Military-grade systems didn't just open like that, even to former specialists. Someone had altered the base's internal logic trees. Someone with top-tier clearance and a technical understanding that went beyond standard operations. It was the kind of sabotage done not to cause immediate damage but to measure, to map, to exploit. Trey knew the signs because he'd written playbooks on them years ago. This wasn't a mistake, it was a test run. His first stop was the data server in sub-level C. It was housed in a sealed room accessed only through 2 biometric checkpoints. Most engineers pulled logs remotely, but Trey didn't trust terminals anymore. He slid his ID, pressed his thumb to the scanner, and let the sensor flash against his iris. The door clicked. Inside, cold air hummed from cooling units surrounding rows of servers that blinked like stars in a digital sky. He moved with purpose, bypassing front-end systems and heading for the second tower in the 3rd row. That one stored protocol backups, raw, unfiltered data logs not yet scrubbed by automated flagging systems. He plugged in a device the size of a matchbox and waited as it began indexing the last 72 hours. The data scrolled too fast to read, but patterns emerged as he filtered for command line access instances. 10 anomalies. 7 of them were harmless. Testing routines, software updates, and drills. The last 3 were something else entirely. They came from separate departments but shared identical command signatures. That meant someone was spoofing login credentials across secure terminals, something only a seasoned tech operative or inside asset could do. Trey isolated the timestamps and cross-referenced them with facility movement logs, another set of files technically off-limits but available to those who knew where the access points were buried. The cross-match narrowed the suspect pool, not by name, but by habit. Whoever it was didn't log their terminal activity from a single location. They used different wings of the base, but always between 0200 and 0300. A quiet hour. Minimal patrols. Shift rotations. Trey didn't need a name yet. He needed a pattern. And now he had one. Still, patterns meant nothing without context. So he took the data to Quinn. She met him in the rec wing, disguised as two off-duty staff sipping lukewarm coffee. Trey passed her the device under the table. She didn't say anything until after she scanned through it on a burner tablet. When she finally looked up, her expression was grim. "Whoever this is," she muttered, "they're 3 layers deeper into the system than even internal security." Trey nodded. "And they've been careful not to trigger any protocol alarms. These aren't just breaches, they're rehearsals." Quinn glanced around before speaking again, keeping her voice low. "So what's the play? You want to shadow the pattern? Stake out those terminals?" Trey shook his head. "That's what they'd expect. They've been this clean for weeks. We won't catch them repeating the same steps. We need to draw them out, interrupt the pattern, and wait for a reaction." That night, they executed the first phase. Trey planted a false diagnostic report, one that mimicked the same kind of error he'd discovered, but triggered it across a different system: internal surveillance. The file was coded to suggest a hardware fault, one that would need inspection, late night, and hands-on. It was bait. And at 2:46 a.m., someone took it. A ghost access pinged from Wing D's backup terminal. Whoever it was logged in executed a command line trace on the fabricated error and scrubbed the entry within 40 seconds. Too fast. Too clean. But not fast enough. Trey's device, modified with old firmware from an obsoleted NSA routine, had captured the MAC address. Not the name. But close. Very close. He and Quinn traced the ping to a secondary engineer's clearance badge. The name was Ethan Hallberg. He wasn't flagged, no prior suspicions. Clean record. Transferred in 8 months ago, from a private contractor aligned with defense research. On paper, he was brilliant, but unremarkable. In person, he was quiet. Polite. Barely visible. That made Trey's instincts hum louder. The best ones never look like they belong. Quinn was already pulling his internal comm logs. "Nothing weird," she said, frowning. "Almost too normal." Trey agreed. "No chatter, no patterns. He's using burner tech outside base network. Probably keeps logs off-site. We need to find out what he's after, and what he's preparing us for." Because Trey no longer believed this was just about sabotage. Not anymore. The deeper he dug, the more he felt it. That this wasn't a lone actor testing the base's vulnerabilities. It was something larger. A precursor to something coming. And the clock had already started. Trey moved through the base the next morning with a strange calm, coating his nerves, the kind that wrapped around the anxiety and pushed it down, focusing instead on the rhythm of footsteps, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, the subtle clicks of security doors opening and closing as if the base itself were breathing. He had the name, the pattern, and the method, but it wasn't enough. Ethan Hallberg didn't trip alarms, didn't leave his desk during odd hours without reason, and never requested access beyond his clearance. He was the kind of man systems were built to ignore. And yet he had slipped past them with such ease that Trey had to consider the possibility this wasn't Ethan's first operation, or his only one. It was possible, even likely, that Ethan was a conduit, not the architect. The real planner, the one orchestrating the rehearsals from the shadows, might still be invisible. Trey needed to know more, and that meant getting closer without tipping his hand. So he arranged to shadow Ethan under the pretext of systems integration testing. He fed Roth the excuse through a sanitized report, highlighting the need for interdepartmental cooperation following the missile anomaly. Roth signed off without blinking, and by noon, Trey had been reassigned to Ethan's wing for a 72-hour joint tech drill. The first shift was all quiet protocol. Ethan was polite, observant, and efficient. He asked the right questions, gave the right answers, and navigated the systems with the confidence of a man who belonged. But Trey noticed things. Ethan never left his workstation without locking down 3 layers of security, overkill for base standards. He wore a smart ring that pulsed every 17 seconds, not visible to most, but Trey saw it, a subtle flicker of red light on the inside band. And during the 3rd hour, Ethan rebooted a maintenance protocol without logging the action through the central console. That wasn't just unusual, it was against protocol. Trey noted the timing, traced the subroutine, and discovered it accessed a closed-circuit diagnostic drive, one not connected to Ethan's department. That meant Ethan was scanning systems outside his operational scope, and he was doing it while feigning routine diagnostics. By the 2nd shift, Trey was certain. Ethan was running shadow protocols. But the question still gnawed at him. Why? The answer came halfway through the 3rd day. A data packet arrived, disguised as a weather update, embedded with an algorithm that bypassed standard filters. Trey's modified monitor flagged it in real time. The packet contained code. Not malware, not exactly. It was a signal, a trigger designed to activate buried subroutines already implanted across the base network. Trey didn't open it directly. He sandboxed it, ran a blind trace, and followed the signal back to a relay pinging off 3 nodes. 1 civilian satellite, 1 commercial fiber line in Nevada, and 1 deep-state relay Trey had only seen referenced in black site dossiers. This was bigger than Ethan. Much bigger. This was coordinated. The relay was proof. Whatever was coming had already been staged and timed. Trey didn't report it immediately. Instead, he spent the next 5 hours watching Ethan's movements like a hawk. At 1,834 hours, Ethan made a mistake. He left his secure laptop unlocked for 13 seconds. Trey had memorized the keystrokes. In those 13 seconds, he accessed Ethan's shell logs, captured the last 12 command entries, and cloned the path to a secondary external device, a small black module hidden behind a power junction near the server access tunnel. That was Ethan's drop point, a digital dead drop used to send or receive instructions. Trey returned at 0400 when no one was watching. He retrieved the device and cracked it open with a portable decompiler. It held 3 partitions. One was filled with encrypted images, surveillance stills of the base interior, focused around the armory, comms tower, and emergency response staging area. The second was a multi-tiered access matrix, a map of the base's control hierarchy, clearly used to trace admin pathways. The third was a timer, set to execute a system-wide protocol override in 6 days, 17 hours, and 12 minutes. Trey stared at the countdown until the digits blurred. This wasn't preparation anymore. This was execution. Ethan and whoever backed him had already staged the breach. The only question was the objective. Disabling the base's systems? Taking control? Launching a false flag? It could be anything. He brought the drive to Quinn the next morning. She paled at the timer. "They're going live soon," she said, barely masking the panic. "We don't have the authority to shut this down ourselves. And if we go to Roth, we risk tipping them off. If they have eyes inside command, we're screwed." Trey nodded. "We can't go up the chain. We have to go sideways. Find their uplink. Kill the relay before the signal goes out." Quinn frowned. "And if there's more than one relay?" Trey's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Then we cut the whole net. Black out the base long enough to isolate the signal paths. If we time it right, we stall the breach and trace their backup routes." It was a dangerous plan, risky, career-ending if it failed. But Trey no longer cared about clearance or promotions or the petty politics of military hierarchy. Something was coming. A trigger buried in code, aimed at systems no one believed could be hijacked. And the enemy wasn't outside. It was already here. Embedded in terminals, hidden behind polite smiles, pulsing quietly through rings that blinked every 17 seconds. He had less than a week. Less than that, if Ethan got spooked. And so Trey moved quickly, preparing a counter-signal, staging overrides, and mapping redundancies. He wouldn't wait for orders. He would act first, because in the silence between blinking lights and quiet footsteps, war had already begun. Colonel Whitaker had never driven faster in his life, weaving through the narrow roads that led toward Hillcrest Veterans Hospital, the adrenaline pulsing through his veins with every second that ticked by. What he'd learned from General Mencken about Emery Goss's past wasn't just astonishing, it was history-altering. As he replayed the classified file in his mind, each line burned itself deeper into his thoughts. The janitor he'd dismissed and doubted for months wasn't just some harmless old man with a mop. He had once led teams of the world's brightest defense engineers, personally authored the core protocols used in the missile command systems they still relied on, and had disappeared from the radar after a mission so secret that even the general staff had only rumors to work with. But what struck Whitaker even harder than the facts on paper was the deep realization of how blind they'd all been. Every day Emery had walked those corridors in faded coveralls, quietly observing broken systems and faulty logic paths, things he had designed decades ago, and not once had anyone taken the time to truly see him. That thought seared at Whitaker's pride and conscience as he finally pulled into the hospital parking lot and leapt from his vehicle, not even bothering to close the door behind him. Inside, the scent of antiseptic and quiet hum of medical machinery greeted him, along with a nurse who blinked in surprise at the sight of a high-ranking officer still panting from a sprint. He explained quickly, flashing credentials and urgency, and was led down the east wing of the building, past rows of quiet rooms filled with the aging remnants of America's long-forgotten military elite. Finally, they reached a private room with the blinds drawn halfway. Whitaker paused at the doorway, collecting himself, unsure what exactly he would say. Inside, Emery lay awake, his chest rising and falling rhythmically beneath a worn hospital blanket. His eyes, though sunken and pale, still flickered with awareness. For a long moment, Whitaker simply stood there, observing the man, this enigma who had swept floors with the same hands that had once calibrated weapons systems capable of global deterrence. The colonel stepped forward quietly and stood at the foot of the bed, clearing his throat. Emery turned his head slowly, recognition in his tired expression, but no bitterness, just calm. It was the same look he wore while mopping hallways, unaffected by status or perception. Whitaker spoke, voice steady yet laced with a remorse that even he hadn't anticipated. He thanked Emery, not in the typical obligatory way, but in a sincere outpouring that caught both of them by surprise. He apologized, too, for not asking questions, for letting his assumptions blind him to the quiet brilliance that had been right under their noses all along. Emery listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving Whitaker's. When the colonel finished, there was a long silence before Emery finally responded, in a raspy but calm voice, that he didn't blame him. He said the world had moved on from men like him, and in many ways, he preferred the anonymity. He'd seen what recognition had done to some of his former colleagues, how it twisted egos, bred politics, and overshadowed the original intent of service. Emery had chosen silence as a form of peace, and while part of him mourned the isolation, another part had learned to live with it. But what Emery hadn't expected was to feel useful again. That moment with the missile panel, it reminded him that his mind still held value, that his knowledge wasn't just dust on forgotten schematics, but living, breathing intelligence. For the first time in years, he felt more than just a relic. He felt seen. Whitaker sat down beside him, pulling from his coat a folder, one he had brought straight from Mencken's desk. Inside were documents reclassifying Emery's position as a consultant emeritus, with full honors reinstated, along with an open invitation to work remotely with the Department of Defense to advise on system vulnerabilities they were just beginning to identify. Hide it. But more than the paperwork, Whitaker explained, the general himself wanted to meet him. Not as a subordinate, as a man seeking wisdom, as a nation paying respect. Emery looked at the folder, then back at Whitaker, eyes moist but unreadable. His voice was barely above a whisper when he asked why now. Why, after all this time? Whitaker answered with what little he could, because sometimes it takes a disaster, a near miss, a flash of the past, to remind the present of what it owes. He admitted it shouldn't have taken a security report or an emergency to bring this moment to light, but it had, and now they had the choice to honor it or ignore it. Emery said nothing for a while, then reached for the folder and placed it on the side table. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would look like, but today, he felt alive. He asked Whitaker one small favor, to tell the younger men in the base, the engineers, the guards, the janitors even, never to judge quietness for weakness. Never to assume a lack of titles meant a lack of history. Whitaker promised, then added with a small smile, that if Emery was willing, they'd like him to visit the base again soon. Maybe not as a janitor this time. Back at the base, the news traveled quickly. The mysterious janitor from Engineering Block B was no longer a ghost in the hallway. He had become a symbol of humility, of forgotten genius, of the quiet dignity that too often slips through the cracks of recognition. The young tech specialists, who once avoided eye contact with him, now whispered his name like a legend. In the officers' quarters, the story passed from room to room, not as gossip, but as a lesson. Something had shifted in the air. A realization that perhaps the greatness we seek in uniforms and ranks often hides in the simple footsteps we overlook. And that perhaps was the beginning of something much bigger than one repaired missile system. The moment Colonel Reyes walked into the command center with the footage in hand, the entire room fell into a heavy hush. A few officers glanced up from their monitors, sensing the gravity in his step, the tautness in his jaw. He inserted the secure drive into the console, and a large screen blinked to life. The security footage from 3 nights ago, grainy but clear enough, began to play. A janitor in a faded uniform, head slightly bowed, pushing a cleaning cart through the long corridor of the missile control wing. The timestamp flickered in the corner. Then, as if guided by instinct, the janitor slowed, peered into the slightly ajar control room door, and noticed the blinking red fault light on the auxiliary launch panel. What followed was stunning. Without hesitation, he stepped inside, left his cart at the door, and approached the control system as if it were second nature. The camera zoomed in slightly. No tools, no manual. He adjusted the diagnostics panel, initiated a reset sequence, bypassed a compromised relay, and restabilized the main guidance subsystem. In less than 5 minutes, the blinking red had gone green. The janitor then calmly exited, glanced once over his shoulder, and resumed mopping the floor like nothing had happened. There was a long silence in the room when the footage ended. General Hargrove stood at the back, arms crossed, eyes narrowed in disbelief. Colonel Reyes exhaled slowly and turned to the others. "This man," he said, tapping on the screen, "isn't just a janitor." No one argued. A quick database pull gave them his name, Luis Mendoza. No active military record in the base database, no special clearances, no engineering credentials. Just an outsourced janitorial worker who had started 6 months ago through a civilian contracting company. But a deeper dive into federal archives, specifically into sealed Department of Defense files, told a very different story. Luis Mendoza, once known as Captain Luis Esteban Mendoza, was a top-tier systems engineer and combat analyst in a covert military research program during the late 90s. He had designed and helped build missile targeting software for one of the Pentagon's classified deterrent systems. He had been a rising star, decorated, published under pseudonyms, and praised in internal reports as a, quote, strategic genius with hands-on brilliance. Then came the incident. In 2002, a classified test went catastrophically wrong. Mendoza had raised concerns about a flaw in the launch stabilization interface, but the oversight board had dismissed his warnings as paranoia. When the system failed during a high-stakes demonstration, several officials pointed fingers, and Mendoza, unwilling to scapegoat his colleagues but also unwilling to lie, took the fall. "Aguantos," He was discharged under obscure circumstances, his record buried under bureaucratic red tape, and his name disappeared from all relevant systems. For over 2 decades, he vanished from the radar. Until now. Hargrove leaned in, close to the screen, face drawn tight in contemplation. Why would a man like that end up here, pushing a mop? He asked, more to himself than anyone else. Colonel Reyes replied, because no one would look for a genius among janitors, especially not one who had everything taken from him. The discovery ignited a flurry of action. Agents were dispatched to locate Mendoza immediately, not to arrest him, but to secure him, debrief him, and, if Hargrove had his way, bring him back into the fold. But Mendoza was already gone. Word reached the general that Luis hadn't shown up for his next shift. His contractor badge had been left at the janitorial locker room. The local bus depot confirmed that a man matching his description had boarded an early outbound headed north, destination unknown. It was as if he had expected to be found out and decided to disappear before anyone could confront him. Meanwhile, whispers began spreading around the base. The footage, leaked by a tech officer before Reyes could contain it, was being passed around. Soldiers, engineers, even the cafeteria staff had seen it. A janitor calmly fixing a complex missile guidance error, like he had done it 1,000 times before. The myth was already forming. An unsung genius in coveralls, walking among them, unnoticed, uncelebrated. Yet not everyone was content with letting Mendoza slip through the cracks again. One junior officer, Lieutenant Karen O'Neill, who had once seen Mendoza at a vending machine and exchanged a brief word with him, remembered the sharpness in his eyes and the humility in his posture. She made it her quiet mission to find him, not to expose him, but to learn from him. She started collecting the fragments he left behind, notes scribbled on discarded napkins in the break room, a carefully annotated manual left in the custodial closet, and even a fixed control board in the diagnostics lab that had mysteriously started working again without being scheduled for repair. Every thread she followed seemed to reinforce the same conclusion. Luis Mendoza hadn't stopped being who he was. He had just chosen to live quietly, to serve in a different way, until someone noticed. General Hargrove, too, felt the weight of the man's choices. He remembered the old saying, "True greatness doesn't seek recognition. It quietly shapes the world while no one is watching." With a team now dedicated to tracking his whereabouts, Hargrove issued a rare command. If we find him, we don't interrogate him. We listen. We offer. We honor him. For the first time in decades, the military wasn't hunting a ghost. They were trying to reclaim a legacy, one that had been wrongly buried. And somewhere, on a quiet bus bound for a town no one could pronounce, Luis Mendoza looked out the window, a small smile forming on his face, knowing that, perhaps for the first time in years, someone had finally seen him. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of revelation and recalibration. News of the janitor who had quietly repaired a broken missile system spread across the base like wildfire, not in the form of a sensationalized story, but whispered in awe and disbelief through corridors and mess halls. Colonel Ira Delgado, the base commander, had ordered a full internal investigation, not to punish anyone, but to understand how such an extraordinary event had slipped past every chain of command. The findings only deepened the sense of wonder. Marcus Holt, listed simply as Facility Maintenance Civilian, had access to no technical stations, was logged only for sanitation rounds, and had not requested or received any permission to be near the strategic command sector. And yet, the data logs proved he had been there, just once, and that one time was enough to intercept a potentially catastrophic system failure. The missile defense software patch that Marcus had deployed, written in obsolete yet brilliant legacy code, was not only effective, it was something not even current engineers could have reverse-engineered without months of work. There was no denying it now. The man was not just a janitor, he was something else entirely. General Desmond Kincaid returned to the base after back-to-back meetings at the Pentagon, all dominated by talk of the, quote, civilian anomaly. Though officially classified, word had begun to leak out to higher-ups, and the pressure was mounting to both secure Marcus and to figure out just who had slipped through the system unnoticed for so long. Desmond didn't relish confrontations, especially with someone who had possibly saved their entire defense grid, but protocol required answers. He approached the modest barracks where Marcus stayed. It was just past evening chow, and most personnel were relaxing or hitting the gym. Marcus, as always, was quietly mopping the hallway, humming under his breath as though nothing in the world had changed. But everything had. Desmond stopped a few feet away and simply watched him for a moment. It wasn't the man's posture or the methodical movement of his mop that struck him, but the aura of total presence and peace. This wasn't a man pretending to be small. This was a man who had accepted something profound about life and himself. When Marcus noticed the general, he paused and leaned the mop against the wall. He didn't salute. He simply nodded. Desmond took that as invitation enough. They sat in the utility room on a pair of overturned buckets, the only sound between them the hum of an old vending machine and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. Desmond didn't waste time. He asked him plainly who he really was, and Marcus, in his quiet way, told the truth. Not the whole of it, but enough to confirm what many suspected, that he had once been a lead engineer on a classified aerospace project that went dark after a budget slash, that his unit had been dissolved, and his work buried under bureaucracy and politics, that he'd walked away, disillusioned, after seeing brilliance turned into red tape. He didn't want his name on a missile or a drone. He wanted peace. He wanted silence. He wanted to mop the floors of a world that had forgotten to listen. Desmond, moved more than he let show, simply asked why he stepped in now after all these years. And Marcus looked at him with eyes that carried the weight of too many wars, both seen and unseen. He said, "Because it wasn't about me anymore. It was about what would happen if I didn't." Desmond left that room changed. He didn't issue commands. He didn't summon Marcus for further questioning. Instead, he made a quiet recommendation to a classified advisory council that Marcus Holt be given full clearance status, under a civilian consultancy role. No uniforms, no press, no labels. Just access to continue doing what he'd already done, protect lives from the shadows. Within days, the security logs were updated. Marcus's title remained unchanged, but his badge now allowed him access to the secure R&D labs. Engineers began seeing him appear at their elbow during tough debugging sessions, never offering orders, only the occasional suggestion, often one that unraveled an entire knot of problems in seconds. Word spread. They started leaving notes for him. Stuck on Logic Circuit 9A. Thoughts? He never signed his name. He just left answers in neat pencil. Meanwhile, the janitorial wing never lost him. He still mopped the floors, still fixed leaky sinks, still greeted the cafeteria ladies by name. He never accepted an office, never sought a raise, never asked for recognition. His only request was that he be allowed to walk the base at night, alone. And so he did. The young security guard who had first spotted him, Elias, was promoted to internal liaison and given special clearance. Not because he reported Marcus, but because he'd been the only one to look beyond the mop. Desmond later told him, quote, "You saw what the rest of us were too busy or too blind to notice. That's leadership." Elias never forgot that. One day, a new recruit asked him, "Is it true the janitor once fixed a missile system?" Elias looked down the hallway where Marcus had just disappeared with his mop and replied, "Yeah. And that's probably the least impressive thing he's done." In those quiet, echoing nights at the base, while missiles slept and satellites turned in silence above, there was a presence felt in every room, a calm sense that someone, somewhere, was keeping watch. Not with weapons, but with wisdom. Not with rank, but with purpose. And he carried a mop, like it was a sword of peace. The base would never be the same. nor would the people in it. Because once you've met a man like Marcus Holt, you never again underestimate the quiet ones. In the months that followed, the legend of Marcus Holt didn't just grow, it rooted itself into the very culture of the base, quietly transforming everything it touched. It started with small changes. The engineering teams began leaving terminals unlocked, not out of carelessness, but with silent invitation, trusting that if Marcus passed by, he might glimpse something they missed. The custodial staff, once relegated to the periphery of the base's ecosystem, found themselves treated with a new reverence, not because they were now suspected of being secret geniuses, but because Marcus had redefined what it meant to be part of the team. Respect stopped following rank. It began following contribution. And contribution, as Marcus had proved, wasn't always loud or labeled. The officers who had once dismissed maintenance staff as background noise now nodded respectfully when they passed in the corridors, acknowledging what had been a blind spot for far too long. Even Colonel Ira Delgado, a man not known for sentiment, ordered a change in policy. Every new recruit, regardless of specialty, would now rotate 1 week in base support, janitorial, kitchen, inventory control, not as punishment, but as orientation. "If you're too proud to mop the floor someone else walks on," he said during the first briefing, "you're not ready to defend the country they walk in." But Marcus himself remained the same. He neither embraced nor rejected his evolving mythos. He simply kept moving, calmly and methodically, as though he'd never been discovered at all. He still started every morning before sunrise, pushing his cart past bunk rooms and briefing halls, pausing sometimes to glance at a diagnostic readout left on a tablet or a half-coded string on a monitor, scribbling notes in the margins, like a phantom mentor. Engineers began adjusting their schedules to catch those notes. They called them M annotations. Nobody ever saw him leave them, but everyone used them. They worked. Better than any manual. Better than any consultant flown in from Washington. Sometimes they even included equations or logic trees so complex that senior analysts at the Pentagon had to reverse engineer them just to confirm they were accurate. They always were. One afternoon, a delegation of high-ranking DoD officials arrived on base, unannounced. Word spread fast. The general assumption was that they were there to interview Marcus directly, perhaps even recruit him back into official service, or offer him public recognition. Cameras were rumored to be part of the entourage. But Marcus didn't meet with them. He wasn't even seen that day. When the officials asked where he was, Delgado simply told them, "He's where he needs to be. And unless you're here to learn, not extract, he won't show." That night, the delegation left. No interviews, no photographs, just a short statement filed quietly through secure channels, recommending the base be designated as a new model of silent operational excellence. Marcus's name was never mentioned. It wasn't until a surprise drill 2 weeks later that the depth of Marcus's influence truly became clear. A simulated cyber attack was triggered without warning, shutting down comms, scrambling radar feeds, and initiating a lockdown across multiple security levels. Officers scrambled. Engineers raced to triage systems. Panic briefly gripped the command room when the base-wide emergency protocol failed to auto-deploy. But then slowly, lights began blinking back to green, not from the command center, but from the relay terminals. One after another, sub-processes came back online through manual overrides that had been quietly pre-programmed into fallback networks. Protocols no one remembered authorizing had already been activated, layered redundancies written in old code, optimized for manual response, and protected against remote override. The signatures on those overrides all traced back to one user, MH72. They'd been in place for over a month. Marcus had anticipated the drill, or, more accurately, he'd anticipated the possibility of real attack, and had written a response so embedded in the base's veins that it functioned like instinct, silent, invisible, and effective. The base passed the drill with the highest score in over a decade. Delgado stood before the crew afterward and said only this: "We were never unprepared. We were simply unaware of how ready we already were. The applause that followed wasn't for him. That night, Elias found Marcus alone by the utility shed behind the radar tower. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the tarmac. Marcus was polishing a mop handle, not because it was dirty, but because, as he once said, if you're going to carry something every day, it deserves your respect. Elias didn't say much. He just stood beside him for a while, watching the horizon. Finally, he asked the question that had been sitting on everyone's mind. Why us? Why here? Marcus didn't answer right away. He looked out over the base. The blinking towers, the sleeping hangars, the rows of barracks slowly lighting up with the rituals of evening. Then he said, because not everything worth saving announces itself, and not every battlefield has flags. Elias nodded, not because he fully understood, but because something deep inside him told him that the most important truths didn't need explanations. They just needed to be witnessed. Later, as Marcus walked back into the base through a side door most people forgot existed, the security camera above the entrance flickered for a brief moment. The system logged him in, as always, under non-essential civilian staff. But somewhere deep in the server logs, hidden beneath layers of routine code, and locked behind an algorithm no one but Marcus understood, another entry recorded the moment. It didn't list a badge number. It didn't list a title. It simply read, Guardian Present. Spring arrived on base with little fanfare, just a subtle shift in temperature and the soft bloom of wildflowers at the fence lines. Life carried on, operations pressed forward, but there was a noticeable change in the air, like the base itself had taken a long breath and now exhaled with quieter confidence. Tasks felt more purposeful. The people felt more synchronized. Even silence, once a backdrop of machinery and routine, now held meaning. Elias found himself waking earlier each day, often stepping outside before sunrise, to watch the shadows stretch along the tarmac, hoping to catch sight of Marcus. Sometimes he did, sometimes not. But it didn't matter. The important thing was the stillness of those moments, the invisible sense that something larger than duty tied all of them together now. It wasn't discipline or tradition or even protocol. It was Marcus. Or rather, what Marcus had awakened in them all. Awareness, humility, presence. No one ever said it aloud, but everyone started carrying themselves differently. Sergeants listened more closely when privates spoke. Officers double-checked the systems themselves before barking orders. People started picking up after each other in the mess, without needing to be told. Pride shifted from personal ego to collective reliability. They weren't trying to be heroes. They were trying not to fail the quiet man with the mop, who had never once failed them. That same season, Base Command finally greenlit a systems overhaul project that had been in bureaucratic limbo for years. It wasn't just prompted by new federal funding, but by internal reports showing a dramatic rise in uptime, output, and personnel satisfaction. These reports didn't name names, but deep within the data trends, analysts kept finding strange clusters of improvement that corresponded not with new tech, but with old systems that had quietly been rewritten or stabilized. Systems with strange back-end code, elegant, minimal, brilliantly patched, bearing the same elusive author tag every time, MH72. One of the IT officers, new to the base and unaware of the lore, submitted a formal inquiry suggesting that MH72 be promoted or offered a systems consultant position. The request was marked, reviewed, and quietly archived. Some things weren't meant to be promoted. Some things work best as myths. Elias was the one who discovered the notebook. It happened late one evening while he was helping inventory outdated equipment for transfer. A rusted-out cabinet tucked behind the old robotics bay had been flagged for removal. Most of it was filled with obsolete wiring and broken relay panels, but at the very bottom, wrapped in plastic and sealed tight, was a simple black leather notebook. No name, no markings, just page after page of numbers, sketches, algorithms and theories. The handwriting was unmistakable, blocky, meticulous, and oddly beautiful in its clarity. At first glance, it looked like a technician's log. But the deeper Elias read, the more he realized this was no log. This was a blueprint, not for a machine, but for a way of thinking. It covered everything from predictive AI behavior in crisis scenarios to human-to-system trust thresholds, even dipping into philosophy, ethics of automation, anonymity in leadership, and the moral obligations of those who can see patterns others miss. There were no answers, just elegant questions and the scaffolding around them, like Marcus had left a trail, not to lead someone to him, but to lead them to themselves. Elias didn't report the notebook. He didn't add it to the inventory. He kept it, carefully resealed, and placed it in the base's library archives under a fabricated reference tag. Every now and then, someone would stumble across it, and if they understood it, really understood it, they'd find themselves different after reading. Like walking out of fog and realizing they'd always been surrounded by light, they just hadn't looked up. That spring, a young woman named Cadet Reyes arrived for her first field assignment. She was sharp, eager, top of her class in systems engineering, but she was also brash, used to praise, and expected to be noticed. On her third day, she challenged a senior officer's diagnostics in open session, and while she was technically correct, the tone landed wrong. Elias watched it happen. He saw her expression afterward, confused, maybe even ashamed, but unwilling to show it. That evening, she was assigned janitorial support rotation. She assumed it was punishment. But when she arrived at her assigned sector, Marcus was already there, cleaning silently, as always. She didn't speak, he didn't acknowledge her. They worked in parallel for hours. At some point, she sat down on a step and just watched him work. The precision, the care, the deliberate pause every now and then, to adjust something small others wouldn't even notice. When she returned to her quarters, she didn't complain, she didn't file a grievance. She just took out her notebook and wrote a single line: "Humility is clarity." After that, she changed. Not instantly, but enough that over time, others began to notice her, not for her credentials, but for the way she listened, responded, and collaborated. Years later, she would lead a national defense initiative on human-AI symbiosis, quoting an unnamed mentor who had once shown her how to scrub floors like she was solving an equation. And so it went. Marcus Holt remained, always early, always quiet, always watching systems the way one watches the ocean, aware that beneath the surface there is complexity so vast, only reverence can approach it. He never sought recognition. But recognition began to reshape itself around him, not as spotlight or fame, but as legacy, the kind built not on what is said, but on what is felt long after the words fade. Base Echo 12 became more than a facility. It became a crucible of culture, forged by the most unassuming man within its walls. And still, he carried the mop. The weeks following the ceremony were unlike anything the base had seen before. The usually quiet and utilitarian hallways echoed with the buzz of new energy. Recruits passed by with a subtle reverence in their eyes whenever they saw Eli. Officers, once too busy or disinterested to acknowledge him, now made time to greet him or engage in a brief conversation, their demeanor carrying a tone of respect that hadn't been there before. The story of what had transpired had spread not only through word of mouth, but had been formally acknowledged in internal military briefings and security debriefs, as well as subtly referenced in a few authorized news channels. Of course, Eli's true past remained mostly classified, with only the essential parts cleared for public knowledge, but the version that did circulate was enough to leave people in awe. A former defense engineer turned janitor, who had once been buried in bureaucratic silence, now honored for preventing a potential catastrophe, he had become a quiet legend. But for Eli, it wasn't about the fame or recognition. It never had been. He continued to mop the floors and check the facility's bins, still taking the night shift, still humming the same songs he always had. The difference now was in how others looked at him, not with pity or dismissal, but with curiosity, admiration, and something even deeper: trust. General Halvorson, too, was transformed in the eyes of his peers. Known once as a by-the-book officer with a tough exterior, he was now seen as a leader who recognized value beyond titles. His decision to elevate Eli had earned him not just points with command, but a deeper sense of respect from his subordinates. He had proved that leadership wasn't about clinging to protocol, but about seeing people for who they really were. The dynamic between him and Eli had also shifted. There was a deep, unspoken camaraderie there, one built not on rank, but on truth, experience, and shared purpose. The general would occasionally stop by the break room, where Eli now had his own small table by the corner window. Sometimes they'd chat about missile systems, sometimes about philosophy, and other times about nothing important at all. Just two men who had once been on opposite ends of the hierarchy, now bound by something far more meaningful. As for Adrian Knox, the young security guard whose decision to trust his instincts had set this entire chain of events in motion, he had been promoted to a specialized training program. Hires e preferi. It was the general himself who signed off on his transfer, noting in the letter that Adrian demonstrated, quote, exceptional discernment and the courage to see beyond appearances. The day before he left for training, Adrian visited Eli one last time on the night shift. They shared a quiet moment in the corridor where it had all started, where Adrian first saw Eli hunched over the open missile interface, silently doing the impossible. Eli simply handed him a folded piece of paper, no words exchanged. Adrian opened it after he got on the shuttle the next morning. It was a quote, handwritten in Eli's clean, simple script. The most powerful tools are often in the hands of those no one notices, until the moment they are needed most. Eli's story continued to ripple outward. A few months later, he was invited to speak at a closed military innovation conference under the pseudonym the Janitor Engineer. His identity was protected, but his message hit home. His speech was short, technical in parts, but overwhelmingly human. He spoke about forgotten knowledge, unseen people, and the importance of humility in high places. A recording of his talk, though not officially released, became something of a legend within circles of senior leadership training, used to teach new officers about situational awareness, unconventional thinking, and the unseen potential of every member of a team. Meanwhile, back at the base, Eli had begun mentoring a few interested engineers during his spare time. He never called it teaching, and he refused any formal titles. "I'm just a janitor who's fixed a few things," he'd say with a smile, but for those young minds, the chance to learn from him was priceless. Under his guidance, a small think tank was formed, eventually given the name Project Echo, a nod to how silent knowledge, like an echo, can return with power when least expected. In the quiet of his room, long after the lights in the corridors had dimmed and the halls fell silent, Eli would sometimes sit by his desk, looking at the aged photograph of his old team from decades ago. Some were gone now, others he had lost touch with, but in those faces, frozen in time, he saw the beginning of it all. The sacrifices, the breakthroughs, the betrayals, the silences. And now, somehow, the closure. He hadn't planned on any of this. He had come to the base to disappear, to live a quiet life, to bury a past too painful to carry. And yet, fate or providence, or perhaps just the sharp eyes of a young guard named Adrian, had drawn him back into the light. And though he still preferred the solitude of the night shift, there was a new lightness to his step, a calm in his breath, a peace he hadn't felt in years. Eli never asked for a plaque, never requested any honors, and certainly never sought out a promotion. But one day, tucked discreetly on the wall near the system's control room, a small brass engraving appeared. It read, "To those who fix things when no one is watching, you make the world safer than anyone will ever know." No name, no title, but everyone who passed it knew exactly who it was for. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.